Get ready for your daily dose of WordPress and web development tips, tricks, and insights to help you find success with WordPress. You're listening to WP the Podcast with your hosts, David Blackman and Tim Streifler.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of WP the Podcast, brought to you by WP Gears. I'm David Blackman.
And I'm Tim Streifler.
Today in episode 635, we're going to talk about how you can reduce WordPress database bloat. And this is important because speed matters when it comes to not only your visitors, but search engines' algorithms place a high importance on how fast your website loads. And if you get your database bloated over time, which it will, that's just how WordPress works, you need to know how to clean it up. We're going to give you some tips and tools. So, Tim, before we dive in, why don't you tell us what WordPress database bloat is?
Yeah, definitely. So WordPress, basically, it stores content inside of a MySQL database. And so you basically have two parts to a WordPress website. You have the files, and then you have the content. And the files is stored in a normal file structure, and that's your WordPress software itself, as well as your plugins and your themes and your media uploads. But everything else is stored in the database. So content, settings, everything from like menus, all the things that you're doing within your theme or page builder, all of those settings and stuff are stored in the database as well. So like really, if you think about it, everything if you strip away the database, you basically have an empty website. And so everything that you're doing and changing and customizing and creating is stored in the database. So it's a huge portion of the site. And so the longer your website's been around, the more and more bloated the database can get. And so there's a couple things that will really bloat your database. One of them being WordPress revisions. And so I'm going to let David talk about how to do this, but basically WordPress revisions, when you make changes to a WordPress page or post or whatever, WordPress by default will store revisions. And so it's basically different versions of the page so that you can go back and undo changes that you've previously saved. And so it sounds like a great idea. The problem is if your website's been around for a while and you've made a lot of changes and you're kind of designing and saving, well, all of a sudden, before the site even goes live, you have a huge bloated database of revisions and you have like 50 different versions of a page or post. And so that's a problem. So yeah, over to you, David.
Dang, Tim just stole my thunder, man. That's the one that I could talk about it at length. And the way that you handle that, the easiest way to handle that is to use a plugin called Better Delete Revisions. And it's a plugin that you can find in the WordPress repository. And it's awesome. And if you had to go in and manually delete these, or even go in the database and delete them manually from the database as opposed to on your WordPress website, it would take a lot of time and it would be really cumbersome. This thing allows you to do it automatically and stuff. You can there's a lot of features and things that you can do to make that happen. Tim, what's number 2?
Yeah, number 2 is optimize database after deleting revisions. And so this plugin, it's a separate plugin, but it's meant to be used with the plugin David just talked about. And basically, after you delete the revisions, it will go in and it'll optimize your database. I'm not a MySQL expert, so I'm not going to try to tell you what exactly it does to optimize, but it's something good to do. And so we definitely recommend doing that.
The third thing that we recommend is to code snippet to limit the number of revisions. So I don't know if we have the code or not to give people, Tim, but it would be great if we could put this in our show notes. I'm pretty sure we could get it. If we don't have it, I could get Jonathan to give it to us. But you can put a piece of code in your website which is going to control the number of revisions that WordPress is going to store in the database. Yeah, that's pretty much that simple. I can't say anything more to it than that.
Yeah, and I think there's some, might be a plugin as well, but basically by limiting the number of revisions to maybe the last 5, you still have that fallback in case you need to revert back to a previous version without getting a huge database. So it's like, and WP Engine actually, they're hosting, when you have a website with WP Engine, revisions don't work at all. However, there's times where I really wish that it did work. And so having kind of something in between a ton of revisions and no revisions, is the ideal situation in my opinion. So we'll see if we can get. I found a blog post here we'll put in the show notes on how to limit revisions. And the next thing here is kind of separate but similar, and that is to actually go into phpMyAdmin and remove database tables of unused plugins. And so, for example, if you're kind of in a design development phase of a WordPress website, you're probably installing different plugins, and sometimes it might not do what you want. You deactivate and find a similar one, or or maybe you're using something for a while and then you deactivate and decide you don't want it anymore. Well, depending on the plugin, there's typically going to be some sort of content that's saved in the database, whether it's settings, whether it's actual like content itself, like custom post type content. There's going to be something that's saved in there. And if you go and later reactivate that plugin, any changes that you made previously are going to be there, as if you never deactivated it, which is a nice feature to have so that if you change your mind and come back to it, everything is saved nicely where you left it. However, it's also going to bloat your database if that happens with a lot of different plugins, and plugins you're never going to come back to. You don't really need it to save its data. And so some plugins, very few, will give you a way to remove the data after deactivating it. And it's usually an additional setting you have to turn on to remove the data. But most plugins don't have that. And so the way you do that is from your server. There's a server tool for MySQL databases called phpMyAdmin, and it basically lets you see all of your database tables and rows and all of that. And so you can basically find the different plugins that are on there, and you can actually remove those tables or rows or whatever, or entire databases depending on the plugin. And that can reduce database bloat. Now, I will say this is some advanced stuff here, and you absolutely want to make sure that you have a current backup before you do this, because if you remove the wrong thing, you can completely just break your site into oblivion. And so you want to make sure you have a backup. You want to be careful, but this can be a helpful way of kind of slimming down that database.
Fantastic. Well, there you go, folks. How to reduce WordPress database bloat and why it's important that you take care of it. Tomorrow we've got another great episode, 5 ways to increase your website traffic this month. Tim, until tomorrow, we'll see you then.
Take care. Bye-bye.
We've come to the end of today's episode of WP the Podcast. Join us tomorrow for more daily tips and strategies designed to help you run your WordPress business towards success. Remember to subscribe to WP the Podcast so you can stay up to date with each episode. And don't forget to rate and review us. We'll see you again tomorrow right here on WP the Podcast.